And we've talked about this before. I might as well mention it now because somebody got mad at me in one show when I said, well, we're talking about Mequisedec and about how that Mequisedec is a priesthood. And if you read in the book of Ivrim or Hebrews, he says, look, Melek-Tazdik has no mother and no father. But when you look at the Gospels, it says Mashiach has this mother. But in the Hebrews, it says Melek-Tazdik has no mother, no father. Of course not, because Melek-Tazdik is king and priest. There is no mother and father to the office. It's an office, not a person. And so when he talks about Mashiach being Melek-Tazdik in the order of Melek-Tazdik, he's a priest in the order of Melek-Tazdik. That is to say, king and priest. And equally important to that king and priesthood is actually this idea of the mantle of king and priest, which Enoch was seventh from Adam, and then Noah is claimed to be eighth, wearing the mantle of the priesthood of Melek-Tazdik. So I wanted to kind of clarify that before we get too far into it. But so Shem arguably is the one who held the order of Melek-Tazdik in the city of Shalom, also called Shalem or Salem, which would later become held by the Jebusites when the Jebusites built a fortress near Salem, actually right next door to the village. And that fortress becomes Yebu Shalom. So the town was Shalom, or I think maybe the dialect was probably Shalem. And it was Yebu Shalem. But the bait being shaped like this with a line, if you take that line out because the scroll kept turning and moved the line away, it would come to look like a resh. And so Yebu Shalom becomes Yerushalom, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, this fortress of the Jebusites, right? And then from Shem, of course, Abraham comes to study with Shem. Now, somebody put up the other day, a timeline of the lives of all the patriarchs. And, of course, using the Masoretic text and not the Septuagint, which adds 100 years to, 7 patriarchs. But if you leave out that Septuagint extra centuries, and you go back to what's in the Masoretic text and you follow those years, you'll discover that Shem outlived Abraham, outlived Yitzchak. Only Yaakov outlived Shem. So the book of Jasher tells us that Abraham actually went to study with Shem, with Melek-Tazdik, and he was given the Hebrew language such that he was able to read the scrolls. So do we know what scrolls were there? Well, Enoch is probably more than one scroll, especially when you're talking about first Enoch. And for the purposes of this discussion, let's clarify. There are 3 books of Enoch, supposedly. You have one Enoch, which is the one that the fragments were found in Cave 4 at Qumran, which was published by the Ethiopian and Assyriac churches that were notoriously founded by Kepha or Peter, Simon Peter. And those churches published Enoch, and they have the same edition of Enoch, and they are conspicuously consistent with the fragments in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it was the Ethiopian Enoch, the 3 copies that were brought back into England and translated initially by D.H. Lawrence and later by Charles and later by Knib. But all of that came from the same Ethiopian text, which had an origin at a bare minimum from the 2nd century A.D. A bare minimum the 2nd century A.D., but the caves in Qumran indicate that it had an origin at least in the 3rd century B.C., and that was probably a copy taken from scrolls that were much, much older. So what we see here is that Enoch has a tremendous secular record that appears to put it back at least to 300 BC and much farther. And the record also substantiates that the Enoch we see now as one Enoch is very, very close, very, very accurate to the Ethiopian Enoch, and that was very, very close or accurate to the Essene fragments. So there is a substantial body of circumstantial evidence here demonstrating the credibility of this book, that it's not a fraud, it's not a forgery, it's not a fake book. It was a book that existed at that time and is older than most of the books we see, of course, in the New Testament, and as old as any record that we have as to the Old Testament. So as a consequence, if you're going to say, well, does not have enough substantiation historically, you have to toss out virtually everything in the Old Testament. One of the most curious aspects of Hanok, I know a lot of people want to talk about the Watchers, that part of Hanok, but I want to say this about the book. Remember that when you read the book, you'll discover that the book was primarily written by Hanok, but there's a big chunk of it written by Methuselah, and there's a chunk that's written by Noah. So you have kind of three different books there. So they probably came out in three different scrolls before they were compiled into a single scroll. And also you have these different testimonies. So you have the testimonies of the Watchers, and then you have these three parables that Hanok is going to go into. And you have this expansive prophecy, including a number of messianic prophecies. Now, just to substantiate a little bit more on the credibility of the book, there is a ton of evidence indicating that the book was relied upon in the New Testament. And we're going to get to that. But let's start with this second slide here. And Hanok walked with Et Elohim after he begat Et Methuselah 300 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Hanok were 365 years. And Hanok walked with Et Elohim, and he was not, for Elohim took him. That's a very interesting phrase. Let's pop into slide 3 here, because we will see here again now that this idea of Hanok being taken is going to be discussed again in Bereshit, or the book of Genesis, and also in the book of Hebrews, of Ivrim. Now, again, we see here at the end of the Old Testament, the book of Jude or Yehuda, and the book of Ivrim or Hebrews, we see this discussion, and the book of Second Kepha. We're going to see these discussions about Hanok, right? About Hanok. And so let's see here. So in Genesis, Bereshit, chapter 5, verses 21 through 24, it reads, and Hanok walked with Et Elohim, and he was not, for Elohim took him. Well, our writer here in Ivrim, or the book of Hebrews, is going to tell us, he says, by belief, Hanok was translated, that he should not see death and was not found, because Yahweh had translated him, for before his translation, he had this testimony that he pleased Yah. Now, this is from the book of Hebrews, Ivrim, chapter 11, verse 5. So we have to ask ourselves the question, what is he talking about? Enoch was translated. What is he talking about here translated? Well, let's see. So we have this passage in Colossians or Colossim. This is an epistle, if you will, of Paul, the worker, and he writes in Colossim chapter 1, a very important chapter in my opinion, who has delivered us from the power of darkness and has translated us into the kingdom of his Et Yahid, or the beloved one. He's asking the question that we as believers in Mashiach, by the confession of our faith, by the overtness of our faith, by the overtness of our belief, are translated into the kingdom. While we are still living in the flesh, nonetheless, we are translated into the kingdom, okay? And again, in Ivrim, by belief, Hanok was translated that he should not see death and was not found, because Yahweh had translated him. So if we look at the Hebrew word, now we're gonna jump into the Hebrew word here, and that's in slide 6. It says that the Hebrew word is lachach. That's Strong's H3947. You can pull it up for yourself, take a look, which means to take in the wildest variety of applications, to accept, to bring, to buy, to carry away, drawn, fetch, or get, to enfold, to mingle, to place, to receive, to reserve, to seize, to send for, or to take away, to take up, to take up. You see, so yeah, you have a Greek word here trying to find how am I going to deal with this Hebrew word lachach, how do I translate that? How do I exchange the Hebrew word, the Hebrew meaning, lachach, for this Greek word, which is this mephistemi. How do I do this? Okay, well, let's take a look and let's see if this word lachach is used in the Ivrit, and what are some examples. So in slide 7, we'll see that in the sweat of your face shall you eat bread till you return unto the ground, for out of it you were taken, lachach, for dust you are, and into dust you shall return. So here you see, yes, it's true. Okay, so here's some dust. So Yah gathers up the dust, and he says, okay, so out of the ground you were taken. But it doesn't tell you the whole story, because out of the ground you were taken, and then from this ground, this adamah, we have this neshama chayim. We have this breathing of lives, the breathing of lives, neshama chayim, into the nostrils of this dust, and the dust becomes a nefesh chaya, a living soul. And so when this happens, you are now translated from earth to a living being,